In a fateful moment beside a grave covered with white chrysanthemums, Hunter, a cold-hearted billionaire whose heart had been frozen by years of solitude, discovered James, a mysterious boy with the eyes of the woman he loved more than life itself. From that point, his meticulously arranged life, like a chessboard, was thrown into chaos as a horrifying secret slowly unraveled. James was the son of Mason Bennett, a ruthless power broker willing to trample anything to possess what he desired. Hunter's loyalty was torn between a promise to protect the boy from the impending storm and the ghosts of the past threatening to drag them both into an inescapable vortex. Would the fragile bond just beginning to bloom be strong enough to withstand the tide of power, or would fate once again thrust James into the loneliness he had grown all too accustomed to? The autumn air at Bluewood Cemetery in California was like a mournful symphony of nature. A biting chill seeped through every finger. Golden brown leaves rustled and fell like the dry tears of the heavens, scattered along the old stone-paved paths. Hunter Nelson stepped out of his sleek black Cadillac, a quiet symbol of his power, adjusting the sleeve of his meticulously tailored suit, each stitch a testament to his stature in this world. He was a wealthy man, a titan in the tech industry, the CEO of a billion-dollar empire where every decision he made could send markets trembling. But today, as his polished leather shoes crunched against the leaf-strewn gravel, as he walked past rows of moss-covered tombstones, he no longer felt like a master of authority. Here, amid the stillness of death, he was merely a solitary pilgrim, carrying a heart heavy with memories. Today was a special day, marking 5 years since Olivia, the woman he loved more than life itself, had left him forever. Every year, he came here without fanfare, without an entourage or the whispers of the press. No board meeting was important enough, no merger big enough, no deadline urgent enough to keep him from standing before her grave. It was just him, the frigid silence, and a grief like an old wound, never healing, only quietly bleeding within. As he drew closer, the gravel crunching beneath his feet like a clumsy tune, he suddenly froze. A small figure appeared beside Olivia's tombstone, an unexpected stroke in the melancholic painting of his mind. It was a boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, huddled like a lost fledgling. His tiny hands clutched his knees, his thin, faded jacket trembling in the biting autumn cold. His messy brown hair looked as though it had been tousled by a storm, his pale face a blend of innocence and a profound sadness, a sorrow so deep even the oldest souls might bow in reverence. Hunter frowned, his thick brows, accustomed to commanding the world, now knitting together in confusion. This cemetery was his sacred place, where he preserved Olivia's memory like a treasure no one could touch. Yet here was this small stranger, sitting beside his wife's grave, as if he had belonged there all along. Hunter cleared his throat, his voice resonating with authority tinged with curiosity, like an aging king confronting an enigma. "Hey kid, are you lost?" he asked, his warm, gravelly tone unable to mask his suspicion. The boy looked up, his large, watery eyes locking onto Hunter's with an intensity that made him instinctively step back. There was something in that gaze, a haunting familiarity, like a beam from the past piercing straight into his soul, sending a chill down his spine. Those eyes, gentle and fathomless, were so strikingly like Olivia's that his heart felt squeezed in a vice. The boy shook his head slowly, his voice soft as falling leaves in the wind. "No. I came to see my mom." Hunter thought he'd misheard. His heart pounded as if it might burst from his chest, a wave of cold spreading from his scalp to his toes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice no longer steady as it was when addressing hundreds of shareholders. The boy hesitated, then pointed a small hand at the inscription on the marble headstone. "Olivia Smith." Hunter's world tilted. His breath quickened, his mind spinning like a malfunctioning machine, trying to piece together fragments that refused to fit. Olivia had never been pregnant, at least not that he knew. They had once dreamed of children, of warm evenings by the fireplace with the sound of childish laughter echoing through. But life, with its endless hours of work, unspoken tensions and silent sacrifices, had stolen that dream. Then Olivia was taken from him in a fateful accident, leaving Hunter with a void nothing could fill. Yet now, a boy stood before him, claiming to be her son. Hunter knelt beside him, his hands trembling, the calm facade he wore daily shattering like crystal on stone. "What did you just say?" His voice shrank, almost afraid of the answer. The boy sniffled, wiping his nose with a tattered sleeve, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on Hunter. "She's my mom," he repeated, his voice steady as a vow. "She used to visit me before she went away." A shiver raced down Hunter's spine, as if the autumn wind had turned to ice and blown through his bones. If Olivia had a child before they met, why had she never told him? And if this boy was born after their marriage, how could she have hidden such a monumental secret? He studied the boy closer, and the resemblance became vivid, like a living portrait. The gentle brown eyes, the delicate features, all echoes of Olivia, a part of her he'd never known. Hunter swallowed hard, struggling to stay composed. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "James," the boy replied softly, the simple name dropping into Hunter's mind like a pebble into a still pond, stirring countless ripples. His thoughts whirled in a storm of shock, confusion, and a hint of dark humor. He, the man who controlled everything, now felled by a child's few words. If James was telling the truth, then Olivia, the woman he trusted implicitly, the only one who'd seen the real him beneath the polished billionaire veneer, had kept a secret that altered his entire life. But why? Hunter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair flecked with silver, trying to regain some control. "Where do you live, James?" he asked. The boy hesitated again, his small fingers tracing the edge of the tombstone as if seeking comfort. "At the Last Haven shelter on Monorail Street. They take care of me there." Hunter's chest tightened, as if an invisible cord had cinched around his heart. Olivia's son, if that's what he was, living in a shelter? The thought twisted his stomach, as though he'd swallowed a cold stone. "Who told you Olivia was your mom?" he asked, his voice trembling, a horrific possibility flashing in his mind. James looked up, his innocent eyes laced with timeless sorrow. "Miss Zoe at the shelter. She said my mom left me there when I was little, that she loved me but couldn't keep me. She visited sometimes, but then she stopped coming. Miss Zoe said she went to heaven." The boy's voice broke on the last word, and Hunter felt his own heart fracture alongside it. Olivia had visited this boy while he lived through years of grief, believing he knew everything about her. Yet there was an entire chapter of her life, a secret child left behind, that he'd never suspected. Hunter's mind reeled with unanswered questions. What had driven Olivia to hide this from him? Was she afraid he wouldn't accept it? Or was there a pain too great for her to share? The autumn wind blew through, carrying the scent of dry leaves and damp earth, a reminder that life was full of mysteries beyond control. Hunter rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by a helplessness no money or power could fix. This wasn't a deal to negotiate, a crisis to delegate to the board. This was Olivia, James, and a piece of a life he'd never known. He looked at the boy, no longer just a stranger, but possibly a piece of the woman he loved. "Are you hungry, James?" he asked, his voice softening like a clumsy father learning to navigate a new path. The boy nodded faintly, and Hunter offered a sad smile. The smile of a man who just lost his old world, but might have found a new one amid the falling leaves of autumn. Before moving on to the next step, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share with your friends. For the first time in decades of dominating a world of numbers and power, Hunter Nelson stood there, motionless like a statue forgotten by time in the midst of Bluewood Cemetery. He didn't know what to do. A sensation so foreign, almost laughable, for a man who always had a plan for everything, from million-dollar handshakes to the way he brewed his morning coffee. But one thing was as certain as the fading autumn sunlight. He couldn't turn his back and walk away, couldn't pretend this moment hadn't happened. His breath turned into small clouds of mist, hovering in the frigid California air, like unspoken prayers rising into the gray sky. Beside Olivia's grave, the boy named James sat there, small and fragile like the last leaf clinging to a winter branch. His eyes, brimming with tears and fathomless depth, had just shattered every wall Hunter had painstakingly built around his heart over the past 5 years. His mind, once a razor-sharp machine of logic, where every problem had a solution, now refused to accept the obvious truth before him. But his chest sang a different tune, a chaotic melody of doubt, pain, and a flicker of hope he dared not name. He had lived his life by strategy, by careful calculations and calm nods in boardrooms. Yet here he stood, staring at a boy who bore the face of the woman he loved more than himself. "Don't tell me this is real," he muttered inwardly, his inner voice dripping with sarcasm, as if arguing with himself in an imaginary courtroom. He wanted to deny it all, to turn on his heel and convince himself this was just a cruel trick of fate. But James's eyes, identical to Olivia's down to their gentle gaze, held him in place like an invisible tether. The way the boy clung to the tombstone, as if it were the last doorway to a mother he barely knew, broke Hunter's heart. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as a desert, then forced himself to speak, his voice softer, smaller, stripped of the tech mogul's commanding presence. "Who else knows about this, kid?" James lowered his head, his small feet kicking at the pile of dry leaves near the grave, the rustling sound like whispers from departed souls. "Just Miss Zoe," he murmured, his voice faint as a passing breeze. "She told me when I was old enough to understand. She said Mom loved me but couldn't take care of me. She visited sometimes, but then she stopped." The boy hesitated, lifting his glistening eyes to Hunter, twin gems dulled by time. "She stopped because she what happened?" The question struck Hunter like an invisible punch, so forceful he stepped back, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the gravel. The innocence in James's voice, the way he asked as if inquiring about a sudden rain, made Hunter's heart pound. Had Olivia hidden this boy out of guilt? Out of fear of his anger? Hunter didn't see himself as a cruel man. He wasn't the type to slam fists on tables or cast away surprises. But he knew he was a control freak, a man who valued honesty like gold and saw chaos as an implacable enemy. If Olivia thought revealing the truth would destroy their love, was she right? He knelt down, facing James, his eyes, once steely in negotiations, now clouded with regret and doubt. "I didn't know about you," he said, his voice trembling like a leaf about to fall. "If I had, things might have been different." But even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true. Could he have accepted it? Could he have embraced a child, another man's child, and called it his own? His fingers clenched into fists, frustration smoldering like a fire in his chest. He needed answers, not vague hypotheticals, and there was only one way to get them. Standing up, he pulled his phone from his suit pocket, a small device that had once let him command the world. He scrolled through his contacts with the speed of a man fleeing a storm, stopping at Caleb Baker, the most reliable private investigator he knew. "Caleb, I need you to look into something," he said the moment the line connected, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "A boy named James at the Last Haven shelter on Monorail Street. Find out how he got there, who his real father is, and if there's any record tied to Olivia Smith. Do it now." He hung up before Caleb could ask anything, his patience as thin as paper caught in the wind. Turning back to James, he saw the boy watching him with curious, cautious eyes, like a fawn facing headlights. "Come with me," Hunter said, extending a hand, his voice now carrying an unexpected warmth. "Somewhere warmer. You shouldn't be out here in this biting cold." James hesitated, glancing at his mother's tombstone one last time as if asking permission, then slipped his small, icy hand into Hunter's. The gesture was simple, but it hit like an emotional tidal wave, sweeping away the last of his defenses. He led the boy to the Cadillac, carefully buckling him into the passenger seat, then started the engine and sped toward Monorail. California's streets blurred past the windows, bustling and oblivious, unaware that Hunter's world was unraveling with every second. When they reached the Last Haven shelter, a weathered brick building tucked between towering apartments, like an old grandmother amid noisy children, Hunter parked and stepped out. James followed timidly, hands buried deep in his thin jacket pockets, his small shoulders shivering in the cold. Inside, the air carried hints of disinfectant and old books, a scent that stirred distant memories even for Hunter. The reception desk was manned by an elderly woman with silver hair and tired eyes behind thick glasses. She adjusted her frames as she recognized James, offering a gentle smile. "Back again, little sweetheart," she said, her voice warm as a cup of tea. Then her gaze shifted to Hunter, instantly wary, like an old cat spotting a stranger in its territory. "Hunter Nelson," he introduced himself, pulling out his wallet and sliding a business card across the counter, a habit of a man used to opening doors with his name. "I need to see Zoe." The woman glanced at the card, hesitating as if weighing whether he was friend or foe, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. Minutes later, a petite woman with gray hair emerged, Her blue eyes were sharp as knives, but her smile for James was soft as a full moon's glow. She sized Hunter up from head to toe, then spoke, her tone both cryptic and calm. "Mr. Nelson, I wondered when you'd show up here." Her words landed like a stone in the still pond of Hunter's mind, stunning him. "You know who I am?" he asked, suspicion lacing his voice, like a chess player realizing he'd been outmaneuvered all along. Zoe nodded, crossing her arms, her eyes gleaming with the wisdom of someone who'd seen too many tragedies. "Olivia told me about you," she admitted, her voice dropping like a confession. "She made me promise never to contact you, never to tell you. She wanted to protect you both, you and James." Hunter felt his patience slipping like sand through his fingers. "Protect me from what?" he snapped, but Zoe didn't flinch. She sighed, a heavy breath carrying the weight of years gone by. "Olivia loved you, Mr. Nelson, with all her heart. But she had a past she couldn't wash away. When she met you, she made the hardest choice of her life. Giving up James so he could have a chance at a better life. A life she believed you could give him if you knew. She wanted to tell you, tried to muster the courage, but then she was gone before she could." Zoe's words were a cold wind blowing through Hunter's soul, leaving him standing there silent, with a heart heavy with unanswered questions. He looked at James, the boy clinging close, and for the first time, he felt a spark of warmth pierce the icy shell of his grief. A tiny light, but enough to kindle hope amid the autumn darkness. Hunter felt his stomach twist as if someone had gripped it tightly, an unease that even the finest bottles of wine in his cellar couldn't soothe. For 5 long years, he had mourned Olivia, believing he knew her better than she knew herself. From the way she smiled when sunlight streamed through the window to the subtle frown when he came home late. Yet now a hidden corner of her life, like a sealed crypt, had burst open before him. He turned to James, the boy staring down at the floor, his small shoulders hunched like a young sapling about to snap in a storm. Hunter's heart clenched, a sharp sting piercing through him at the sight. A child who had never known the warmth of family, now standing here, awaiting a rejection he was likely all too familiar with. He didn't know what to feel. Anger at Olivia for hiding a secret as vast as the autumn sky, sorrow for the boy raised within the cold walls of a shelter, or guilt that he, the man who claimed to know everything, had been utterly blind to James's existence. He took a deep breath, the icy air flooding his lungs like a reminder that he was still alive, still facing this reality. Turning back to Zoe, he asked, his voice low like the tolling of an evening bell. "What happens to the boy now?" Zoe looked at him, her sharp blue eyes glinting with the deliberation of someone who had seen too many fates pass by. "That depends on you, Mr. Nelson," she replied, her tone even but laced with an unspoken challenge. "The boy has no family, no legal guardian. James has been here since he was an infant, growing up amid dreams that never took shape. If you walk away, nothing changes. He stays here waiting for a home that might never come, like rain in a desert. But if you choose to step into his life, then it's all up to you." Her words landed like heavy stones, pressing down on Hunter's shoulders with a weight he'd never felt, not even in the tensest boardroom days. He had entered Bluewood Cemetery that morning with a simple intent, to place a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, Olivia's favorite, and let his grief quietly gnaw at him in silence. But instead of leaving with a lighter heart, he was walking away with a boy, a living responsibility tied to the woman he loved more than sunlight itself. He crouched down to look at James, the boy still avoiding his gaze, his small hands gripping the edge of his jacket as if it were his last lifeline in an ocean. Cautiously, like a man stepping onto thin ice, Hunter placed his large hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, kid," he said softly, his voice unexpectedly warm. "Let's get out of here." James looked up, his wide eyes widening in surprise, then flickering with a fragile spark of hope, like an oil lamp trembling in the dark. Without a word, he followed Hunter out of the shelter, his small feet taking hesitant steps. The man who had built a tech empire with an iron fist and a razor-sharp mind now stepped outside, hand in hand with a boy, feeling uncertainty for the first time, not of stock markets but of the heart. As they left the weathered brick building, the autumn wind blew through, carrying the scent of dry leaves and an inaudible whisper. His life had changed forever. Hunter drove through California's bustling streets, neon lights and traffic weaving past like a chaotic urban symphony. The newly revealed truth weighed on him like a sodden coat, making each breath a struggle. He glanced at James, the boy sitting silently in the passenger seat, his small hands clutching the edge of his oversized jacket, his gentle brown eyes gazing out the window. The city lights reflected on his face, painting a picture of exhaustion and unease, like a fledgling separated from its flock, unsure if its wings could carry it far. Hunter gripped the steering wheel tightly, telling himself to focus on the next step, but his mind was blank. How could he comfort a child he just met when he was still wrestling with his own tidal wave of emotions? The Cadillac glided silently into the underground parking of a luxurious penthouse near the city center. He turned off the engine and faced James, his voice gentler than usual, like a clumsy father learning to speak words of care. "Come on, kid, let's head inside." James hesitated, his eyes flicking to Hunter as if seeking reassurance, then nodded and stepped out. In the private elevator to the penthouse, the silence between them hung heavy, like the air before a storm. Hunter was accustomed to silence, tense negotiations, high-stakes closed-door meetings, but this was different. This wasn't about stocks or contracts. It was about a boy who had lost everything before even understanding what family meant. When the elevator doors opened, James stepped into the penthouse, his eyes widening at the soaring ceilings, gleaming marble floors and massive windows framing the dazzling cityscape at night. The apartment, with its minimalist furniture and cold design, was where Hunter lived a solitary, efficient life, like a well-oiled machine. But through James's eyes he suddenly saw it as empty, soulless. No toys, no laughter, no trace of the warmth a child needed. He cleared his throat, setting his keys on the marble kitchen counter, trying to break the awkwardness. "You hungry, James?" The boy paused, then nodded slightly. "Yes, a little." Hunter frowned, realizing he had no idea what kids like to eat. His fridge was stocked with fine wines and gourmet takeout containers, but was there anything suitable for a child? He opened the fridge, scanning the neat shelves, then landed on a simple idea. "How about grilled cheese?" he asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. James's face brightened faintly, a small smile breaking through like sunlight-piercing clouds. "Okay." It was a trivial thing, but the warmth in the boy's voice loosened something in Hunter's chest, as if a weight had been lifted. He wasn't good at this, cooking for someone, caring for someone, but at least he could make a sandwich. As he stood in the kitchen, the sizzle of butter in the pan filling the air like a clumsy tune, James quietly wandered into the living room. His small hands brushed the edge of a bookshelf, then paused at a framed photo on the mantel, Olivia, her smile radiant as dawn. His fingers hovered over the glass, as if afraid touching it would shatter the fragile memory. "She's so beautiful," he whispered, his voice soft as falling leaves. Hunter stepped over, standing beside James, his eyes fixed on the photo, the woman they both loved in different ways. "Yeah," he replied quietly, his voice catching. "She was." James turned to him, his brown eyes shimmering with curiosity and sorrow. "Did you love her?" The question stabbed into Hunter's heart like an invisible blade, simple yet heavy as the world. He had loved Olivia with everything he had, but now he realized that love had gaps he'd never seen. He exhaled slowly, searching for the answer deep within. "Yes," he admitted, his voice warm and low. "Very much." James nodded, as if the response had soothed an invisible wound within him. "Miss Zoe said she loved me too," he whispered, his voice trembling like a breeze through dry branches. "But she couldn't keep me." Hunter's throat tightened, his heart aching at the boy's sorrow. A child who'd spent his life wondering why he'd been left behind. Seeing James standing there, small and fragile in the cold penthouse, Hunter knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn away. He, the man who'd built impenetrable walls around his heart, now faced a boy who'd melted that ice. He didn't know what the future held, whether he could be the father James needed, but he wouldn't let this boy face it alone. He placed a hand on James's shoulder, gentle but firm, like a promise unspoken. "After the sandwich, we'll figure things out, okay?" James looked up, offering a faint smile, and for the first time that day, Hunter felt a tiny spark, warm as autumn sunlight, piercing the darkness within him. After a simple dinner, a grilled cheese sandwich that Hunter clumsily prepared, James curled up on the luxurious leather armchair in the living room. His small frame seemed swallowed by the thick cushions, making him look more like a fledgling lost in an eagle's nest than a child in a lavish penthouse. Hunter sat across from him, holding a glass of scotch, taking a small sip and letting the warm liquid slide down his throat like a quiet comfort. He sank into thought, his mind spinning like an old machine struggling to restart. He had called Caleb Baker, his trusted private investigator, asking him to dig deeper into Olivia's past, to find out about James's father, whether he was still alive, whether he was a shadow lurking somewhere, waiting to shatter this fragile peace. But deep down, Hunter already sensed the truth. James had no one else but him. The realization pressed on his chest like a cold boulder, making each breath a labor. Time passed, the city lights flickering outside the window like stray stars in an artificial sky. James's blink slowed, his small head nodding forward, then jerking awake like a kitten startled by a sudden gust. Hunter watched him, torn like a man at a crossroads. Should he take the boy to one of the luxurious but sterile guest rooms, or let him sleep peacefully in that chair, where he seemed to have found a rare sliver of safety? Before he could decide, James's small voice cut through the silence, frail and uncertain like dry leaves falling in the night. "Are you going to take me back?" The question struck Hunter like an invisible dagger to the gut, freezing him in place. He set the glass down on the table, the sound of crystal meeting marble ringing sharply, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locking onto James. "Do you want to go back?" he asked, his voice lowering like a father learning to speak gently. James shook his head quickly, his eyes wide with fear. "No, I don't have anywhere else." Hunter ran a hand through his silver-flecked dark hair, exhaling slowly, as if releasing an invisible burden into the night's river. He wasn't ready for this. Being a guardian was challenge enough, let alone a father. But looking into James's gentle brown eyes, he saw Olivia, and he knew this boy had already lost too much for him to turn away. "Then stay," he said, his voice firm like a vow sworn into the cold wind. James's eyes lit up, a mix of surprise and hope, like a star emerging from thick clouds. Hunter nodded, reinforcing it. "We'll figure it out." James didn't reply, but the way his small shoulders relaxed, the way his hands gripped the blanket as if clutching a flicker of warmth, told Hunter everything he needed to know. Minutes later, the boy drifted into sleep, his steady breaths a soft melody in the quiet room. Hunter sat there, leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the glittering city skyline beyond the window. His life had always been meticulously arranged like a chessboard, every move calculated with precision. Yet in a single night it had all turned upside down. He'd entered the cemetery intending to chew on familiar loneliness, but left with a boy, an unexpected piece that could reshape the entire game of his life. For the first time in years he felt a different spark pierce the void within him, faint but warm, like a small flame in winter. The next morning Hunter jolted awake to faint sounds in the penthouse, usually as silent as a lavish tomb. For a moment, he lay still in bed, staring at the lofty ceiling, piecing together the fragments of the previous night. Reality crashed in like a cold wave. James was here. He was no longer alone. He pushed the covers aside, rubbing his face to dispel the fatigue clinging to his every muscle. His life had never been peaceful, long days of meetings, late nights buried in work. But the presence of another person in this space was an entirely new song, both unfamiliar and challenging. He stepped into the living room, barefoot on the chilly marble floor, and saw James standing by the massive window, wrapped tightly in last night's blanket. The boy's small figure looked even tinier against the skyscrapers and the morning sky painted in vibrant pinks and oranges, like a natural canvas drawn to comfort lost souls. James turned at the sound of footsteps, his eyes flashing with unease like a fawn lost in a deep forest. "I didn't know if I should wake you," he said softly, his voice a whisper like the early breeze. Hunter waved a hand, offering a strained smile, a rarity on his usually stern face. "It's fine, I'm okay." He glanced at the wall clock. 6:30 a.m. too early for a man like him, who'd long abandoned early mornings for late-night meetings and whiskeys. But today the morning carried a different hue. No rush, no pressure, just a boy standing in the opulent apartment, looking as if he wasn't sure he belonged. "You hungry?" Hunter asked, heading to the kitchen, trying to keep his tone light, like a grandfather learning to chat with a grandchild. James hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Hunter frowned, realizing he faced another challenge: cooking. He wasn't a kitchen man. His meals were typically ordered from restaurants or prepped by a private chef. But this morning, he rummaged through the fridge, finding a few lone eggs amid the takeout containers. He cracked them into a pan, the sizzling sound a clumsy tune breaking the silence between them. "Have you been to school?" he asked, striving for a casual tone, more like a gentle interviewer than the tech titan accustomed to issuing commands. James perched on a high stool at the kitchen counter, fidgeting with the blanket's edge, his eyes downcast. "Miss Zoe tried teaching me at home, but she had too many kids to look after." Hunter nodded, unsurprised. The foster system was always a mess, and kids like James often fell through its cracks, like dry leaves dropping from a branch no one bothered to pick up. He wasn't sure what he thought about enrolling James in school. His own life was anything but normal, and he had no idea how to provide the stability a child needed. But seeing the boy sitting there, his small hands clutching the blanket like it held a fragile hope, Hunter knew one thing for certain. James deserved a real chance, a fresh start Olivia might have dreamed of for him. He slid the plate of eggs across the counter, pushing it toward James with an awkward smile. "Eat up, kid. Not as good as a five-star chef's, but at least it's not burned." James gave a faint smile, a glimmer like sunlight through a crack, and Hunter felt his chest warm. He didn't know what he was doing, but for the first time he was willing to step into the unknown. Not with strategy or power, but with the heart of a man learning to love again. Before moving on to the next step, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with your friends. As they ate breakfast, a simple plate of scrambled eggs that Hunter had clumsily prepared, James sat quietly, but it wasn't the closed-off silence of a locked door. He observed Hunter with deep brown eyes, intent like an explorer trying to map an unfamiliar land. Hunter wasn't sure what the boy saw when he looked at him. A cold stranger in an expensive suit, a fragile lifeline in a vast sea, or just a temporary stop before being cast off somewhere else. The idea of becoming a permanent part of someone's life unsettled Hunter, like an old sailor lost in a storm without a compass. He'd never been good at relationships that demanded an open heart, where vulnerability slipped in like cold wind through a crack. But as he watched James push bits of egg around his plate, his small hands fumbling with the fork, Hunter knew he'd unwittingly laid a silent commitment on the table, a promise he couldn't take back, no matter how much his heart screamed to flee. The morning passed in a haze of tangled thoughts. Hunter called Caleb Baker, his voice sharp as a blade slicing through the air, demanding every detail of James's past. Birth records, medical files, any scrap of information that could unravel the tangled story of the boy who appeared by Olivia's grave. He told himself that the more he knew, the better prepared he'd be, like a general readying for battle. But the biggest question, what he'd do with all that information, hovered over him like a dark cloud unanswered. Would he adopt James, become his legal guardian with all the paperwork and responsibility that entailed? Or just keep the boy close as a temporary fix until another door opened? For a man who always knew his next move in the chess game of life, this ambiguity made him restless, as if he were walking a thin tightrope between skyscrapers. By noon, Hunter made another decision, more practical but no less awkward. James needed new clothes. The oversized jacket the boy had worn since the cemetery, tattered and faded, clearly wasn't his, like a relic from an old life. Everything on James, from his worn shoes to his hole-riddled sweater, told a story of neglect that twisted Hunter's gut like a vice. He had no idea how to shop for a child. The stores he knew sold tailored suits and luxury watches, not t-shirts or sneakers. But he knew someone who could help. After a brief call, he found himself in the back of the Cadillac, James beside him, heading to Fifth Avenue where Amelia, his indispensable assistant, awaited. Amelia was a whirlwind of efficiency, sharp as a blade and graceful as a dance. She'd worked for Hunter for years, handling his every odd request without flinching. But when he stepped out of the car with a timid James at his side, even she couldn't hide her surprise. "You didn't tell me you had a kid," she teased, raising an eyebrow with a playful smirk. Hunter shot her a dry look. "I didn't know until yesterday." Amelia laughed, but her gaze softened as it landed on James. She crouched down, her voice warm as spring sunlight. "Hi there, I'm Amelia. What's your name?" James hesitated, his hands gripping the hem of his jacket, then replied softly, "James." She beamed. "Nice to meet you, James. Let's go find you some cool clothes, okay?" The shopping trip went smoother than Hunter expected, thanks largely to Amelia's skill. She picked out clothes with a keen eye, soft sweaters, well-fitted shoes, while Hunter stood by, awkward as a bear in a china shop. He watched James slowly relax, the boy starting to choose things he liked: a blue jacket, white sneakers, and even smiling, a small but bright grin like a street lamp in the dark. Seeing the boy come alive, no longer the mournful shadow by Olivia's grave, felt strange yet warm to Hunter, as if he'd just found a long-lost puzzle piece. That night after dinner, this time pizza ordered from a nearby place, James sat on the couch flipping through a book Amelia had bought him, his small legs tucked up like a curled cat. Hunter sat across, whiskey in hand, his eyes fixed on the flickering city lights outside, like lost stars in an artificial universe. Suddenly James's voice broke through, soft but clear. "Do you ever get scared?" The question hit Hunter like a stone tossed into a still lake, making him pause. He who'd faced brutal boardroom battles, financial storms, and the agony of losing Olivia, had never admitted to fear. But under James's curious gaze he sighed, his voice low like an evening bell. "Sometimes." James nodded, as if the answer were a secret they now shared. Hunter didn't know why that confession struck him so deeply. Perhaps because James, with all he'd lost, his mother, a father he never knew living among strangers, had every reason to be afraid. Yet here he was, resilient like a sapling growing through a rock's crevice. That quiet strength hit Hunter like a hammer, making him see the boy differently. Not just as a duty, but as a small miracle. As night fell, James's eyes grew heavy, his small head drooping onto the couch cushion like a snowflake settling softly. Hunter watched him for a moment, his heart softening like soil after rain. He stood, grabbed a blanket from the other end of the couch, and draped it over James gently, the motion clumsy but meaningful, like an unspoken promise. He didn't know what the future held, whether he could be a father or just a temporary guide, but one thing was certain: James wasn't going anywhere. He returned to his chair, sipping his whiskey, letting the warm bitterness soothe his soul. His life had always run on a plan, a composed symphony with every note precise. But now, with James in the apartment, the rhythm had shifted, and oddly, he didn't want to fix it. A week had passed since he found James by Olivia's grave. The once silent penthouse, like a grand temple, now bore small but undeniable traces of a child. A plate with breakfast crumbs, books forgotten on the coffee table, the TV chirping cartoons like birdsong each morning. James was growing quieter, like a stray cat settling into a new home, but his eyes still held a flicker of doubt, as if he didn't dare believe this was his forever place. Hunter, too, was grappling with these changes. He'd lived an efficient, solitary life where everything was under control, but now he stood in a new world, messy, uncertain, yet strangely warm, and for the first time he wondered if he could learn to love this chaos. That morning, Hunter sat in his lavish office at Manhattan Towers, the muted sunlight filtering through the large glass panels, casting a glow over the stack of financial reports on his desk. But his eyes, usually sharp as a blade when dissecting numbers, now wandered somewhere distant, indifferent to the dry text. Caleb Baker had sent a thick dossier on James's past, lying silently before him like an ancient book brimming with secrets, waiting to be opened. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs like a warning, then flipped to the first page with the caution of a man about to face his destiny. James's birth certificate came up first, the black and white text stark as a judgment from time. Mother's name, Olivia Smith. Father's name, blank, an empty space like an unhealed wound. Hunter had anticipated this, but seeing it in print still twisted his insides, as if someone had dropped a cold stone into his chest. He turned the page, his eyes scanning reports from child services, sheets of paper narrating the sad tale of a boy tossed around by life like a dry leaf in the wind. James had drifted through multiple foster homes after Olivia's death, each leaving marks of neglect, unstable environments, and instances of him running away, like a fledgling seeking a free sky but unsure how to fly. His last recorded placement was with Zoe Mitchell, the woman running an overcrowded foster home on Monorail, where children's dreams were crushed under the weight of reality. But what made Hunter frown was the absence of any explanation for why James had appeared by Olivia's grave that night. No one had brought him there. No guardian had reported him missing. No sign suggested anyone was looking for him. He closed the file, exhaling slowly, his breath mingling with the air like a silent lament. The more he learned about James, the clearer a painful truth became. This boy had been alone for too long, adrift like a star fallen from the sky that no one bothered to pick up. The thought churned his insides, a quiet undertow pulling him from safe waters. Hunter had never pictured himself as a father. He was a man accustomed to commanding empires, not nurturing fragile souls. But now, with James in his life, he felt a growing responsibility, like a small flame flickering steadily, impossible to extinguish. That evening, Hunter returned home earlier than usual, his polished leather shoes crossing the threshold with a hint of hesitation. He found James sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by the new books Amelia had bought, a small fortress of knowledge encircling him. The scene felt almost surreal, like a misplaced painting in the penthouse's cold expanse. He'd seen children at charity events, their distant smiles alongside business partners, but they'd never belonged to his private world, a realm of whiskey, contracts, and solitude. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie, his voice striving for casualness but landing awkwardly, like a novice taking his first steps. James looked up, his brown eyes widening in surprise, as if unused to anyone caring about his day. "Good," he replied, his voice tentative like a leaf brushing the ground. Hunter nodded, sitting on the couch, hands resting on his knees as if preparing for a meeting. "What are you reading?" James hesitated, then held up a book, a classic collection Amelia had picked, its cover slightly worn but compelling. "Do you like them?" Hunter pressed, his tone softening. James shrugged, a small but telling gesture. "I guess. Some are kind of sad." Hunter leaned back, his gaze distant, recalling the stories he'd read as a young man. Not for pleasure, but to uncover hidden lessons, fragments of humanity. "Sad stories can matter," he said, his voice low like waves lapping the shore. "They teach us things we'd stay blind to without them." James nodded, his expression thoughtful like a young philosopher. "Did you read sad stories when you were little?" The question caught Hunter off guard like an unexpected arrow. He had read, of course, but his childhood wasn't filled with storybooks. It was business magazines and financial reports, the stories he'd learned to decode as a boy. "Not exactly," he admitted, a faint, fleeting smile flashing like lightning. James didn't press further, just quietly set the book down and picked up another, flipping through its pages with absent focus. The silence between them grew comfortable, like a warm blanket settling over them both. Hunter watched the boy, noting how James looked healthier, his cheeks rosier from regular meals, his eyes less shadowed thanks to proper sleep. Still, he carried the wariness of someone once hurt, though moments like this revealed a rare glimpse of innocence. "I found out some things about your past today," Hunter finally said, his voice dropping like a confession. James tensed, his fingers tightening on the book's edge, his eyes flickering with unease. "Oh." Hunter hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom didn't list your father on your birth certificate." He watched James's reaction, cautious as if walking on thin ice. The boy swallowed hard but said nothing, his gaze dropping as if peering into an abyss. After a long silence, James whispered, his voice light as a breeze, "She never talked about him." Hunter nodded, unsurprised, though his heart still ached. "Have you ever thought about finding him?" James shook his head quickly, his tone firmer. "No. If he wanted me, he'd be here." The simplicity of that statement pierced Hunter's heart, sharp as a blade yet bloodless. James's logic was heartbreaking in its raw truth, like a short poem heavy with meaning. Hunter didn't know how to respond, only nodded, letting the silence remain their companion. That night, after James had fallen asleep on the couch, Hunter stood by the window, gazing at the city sparkling like a sea of artificial stars. His mind restless, he felt like a ship lost in an endless ocean. He'd built his life on logic and profit, weighing risks like a master chess player. But this wasn't a business game. This was a boy, a piece of Olivia, and a decision money couldn't solve. He could find James another home, hand him off to someone else, but the thought left a bitter taste like spoiled wine. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his reverie. Caleb's voice came through, direct as always. "I found something else." A sealed record from an old database. Olivia Smith filed for a paternity test when James was a baby. It never went through, but the name she listed as the potential father. Caleb paused, as if aware his next words would upend everything. Mason Bennett. The name thundered through Hunter's mind like a storm. Mason Bennett, a ruthless billionaire who dismantled companies overnight, a man Hunter had clashed with in brutal business wars. The idea that James could be his son was almost unthinkable, but if true, everything would change. You sure? Hunter asked, his voice taut as a wire. 100%, Caleb replied. Olivia suspected it but didn't confirm it before she passed. Hunter exhaled, his hand tightening on the phone, his mind spinning like a tempest. If Mason Bennett knew about James, he wouldn't let it lie. A man that controlling would claim the boy, whether James wanted it or not. Hunter had played power games for decades, but this time he wasn't fighting for money or prestige. This was about James, a boy who'd lost too much, and Hunter wouldn't let Mason Bennett steal the fragile piece he just found. He stared out at the city, his gaze hardening like steel, and made a silent vow. Even if it meant facing the world, he'd protect James. Hunter barely slept that night, his eyes wide open in the darkness of the penthouse, like an old owl lost in a storm of thoughts. The revelation that Mason Bennett, the ruthless shark of the business world, capable of swallowing entire companies with a smirk, might be James's father sent his mind reeling, like a car skidding on a slick road. He'd faced cold-blooded men like Mason before, men willing to trample anything to get what they wanted. But this wasn't a power play in a boardroom with numbers and contracts. This was a boy's life, a small soul already scarred by too much pain, and Hunter swore to himself with everything he had, that he wouldn't let Mason Bennett swoop in like a whirlwind and steal the fragile piece James had just found. As dawn peeked through the large windows, bathing the room in pale gold, Hunter made a decision. He needed to confirm the truth, not out of curiosity, but to shield James from any waves that might crash in. More importantly, he needed to know what he'd do if Mason truly was the boy's father. He couldn't let James be thrown into another spiral of uncertainty, like a dry leaf swept away by an endless wind. At breakfast, James sat quietly at the kitchen table, his small fork poking at a plate of scrambled eggs, his eyes downcast as if peering into a wordless mystery. He seemed more guarded after last night's conversation, that familiar wariness wrapping around him like a thin suit of armor. Hunter watched him, a strange protective instinct rising within, fierce as a smoldering fire he couldn't extinguish. "How would you feel about going to the park today?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with awkwardness, like a novice learning to sing. James glanced up, his brows furrowing as if the question were a riddle. "The park?" Hunter nodded, forcing a stiff smile. "Central Park. I thought you might want to get out, breathe some fresh air." James hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the table's edge, then gave a slight shrug. "Okay, I guess." It wasn't the enthusiasm Hunter had hoped for, but it was a faint glimmer in the boy's cloudy haze. They arrived at Central Park that morning, the crisp autumn air a soft whisper from nature, not too cold but enough to flush James's cheeks. The park buzzed with life, the rhythm of joggers' footsteps, distant echoes of children's laughter, and the lively tune of a street saxophonist nearby, like a melody welcoming the day. James walked beside Hunter, hands buried deep in the pockets of his new jacket, his eyes darting around like a fawn lost in an urban forest. Hunter recognized that look, the look of doubt, of someone who never felt they belonged anywhere. He'd seen it in young business associates, out of place in his world of power, but with James it ran deeper. It wasn't just insecurity. It was a fear of abandonment, an invisible scar etched into his soul. They stopped at a bench near the lake, where ducks glided silently, leaving shimmering ripples under the sun. James sat quietly watching a group of kids laugh as they tossed bread to the ducks. Hunter sat beside him, hands clasped, his mind wrestling with how to start the conversation he knew they needed to have. "Your mom never talked about your dad, did she?" he began, his voice low like waves against a rocky shore. James tensed but nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the water. What if she tried to find him? Hunter pressed, choosing his words as carefully as a man stepping on thin ice. James turned, his brown eyes flashing with alertness. "What do you mean?" Hunter took a breath, weighing each sentence. What if she suspected who he was and tried to confirm it? James frowned, his small face pensive like a young philosopher facing life's enigma. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft as falling leaves. "She never said anything. She just worked a lot. She didn't talk about stuff like that." He looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking to himself. "I think she was scared of something." Those words hit Hunter like a hammer, stirring a familiar unease, the kind he'd felt facing his riskiest deals. If Olivia was afraid, it wasn't without reason. And if Mason Bennett was truly James's father, that fear might have a clear root, like a shadow lurking behind the dazzling light of power. "If you had the chance to know for sure, would you want to?" he asked, his tone gentle but deliberate. James hesitated, his hands clenching into small fists in his pockets, then shrugged. "I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter." "He's not here, is he?" Hunter exhaled slowly, his breath mingling with the air like a silent prayer. The boy had learned not to expect, not to hope. A harsh lesson life had carved into him, like an inscription on cold stone. "What if he knew about you?" Hunter continued, his voice cautious as if crossing a minefield. "What if he found out?" James stiffened, his eyes flashing with rare resolve. "I don't want him," he said quickly, his voice sharp like a small blade. "I don't care how rich or powerful he is. He wasn't there when my mom needed him, so why would I need him now?" The certainty in James's words swept through Hunter like a fierce wind, leaving him stunned. The boy didn't crave a prestigious father or an empire to lean on. He needed stability, a harbor that wouldn't vanish at dawn. Hunter felt a spark ignite within him, like a street lamp flaring to life in the dark. He didn't want to hand James over to anyone, not even Mason Bennett. He sat there silent beside James, watching the ducks glide across the lake, leaving ripples that spread like unanswered questions. He wasn't sure when this shift had begun. Maybe that night he found James by Olivia's grave, or the moment the boy smiled while picking out a blue jacket at the store. But the thought of letting James go now felt wrong, like a sour note in a perfect symphony. His life had always been built on solid plans, calculated steps like a flawless dance. Yet here, sitting with this small boy in Central Park, Hunter realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the unexpected. Like a poem without rhyme, brimming with feeling. He placed a hand on James's shoulder, gentle but firm, a silent promise. Whoever Mason Bennett was, Hunter wouldn't let this boy fall into anyone else's hands. That evening, Hunter stepped into Caleb Baker's office, the air thick like the sky before a storm. The dim glow of an old desk lamp cast shadows across Caleb's face, highlighting the lines of a man accustomed to confronting dark secrets. The weight of the decision pressed on Hunter's shoulders like a sodden cloak, making each step heavier. "We need a paternity test," he said bluntly, cutting through the stillness, his voice sharp as a blade. Caleb, with the cold professionalism of a seasoned detective, merely nodded. "I can arrange it discreetly," he replied, his tone steady like waves lapping the shore. "But if Mason Bennett finds out, he'll come for you." Hunter clenched his jaw, his face tightening like a taut string about to snap. "Then we make sure he doesn't, not yet." Caleb studied him for a moment, his piercing eyes seeming to bore into Hunter's soul. "You've made up your mind, haven't you? Whether he's the father or not, you're not letting James go." Hunter sighed, rubbing his face, his fingers trembling slightly under the pressure he tried to hide. "The kid's been through enough," he admitted, his voice hoarse as if emerging from a nightmare. "I won't let some arrogant billionaire waltz in and claim him like a corporate takeover." Caleb smirked, a wry half-smile laced with irony. Funny stance, coming from an arrogant billionaire. Hunter shot him a frigid glare, but Caleb just chuckled softly, unfazed. "All right, I'll handle the test quietly. But if Mason's the father, we need a plan." "He doesn't play fair." Hunter nodded, his heart heavy as stone. He knew Mason Bennett well. A shark in an expensive suit, a man who'd driven companies to their knees until they begged for mercy. But James wasn't a company to be traded, not a figure on a balance sheet. He was a child, a fragile soul Hunter had begun to see as a rare light in his cold existence. 2 days later, Caleb arrived with a plain white envelope, simple yet weighty as if it held fate itself. Hunter opened it, his hand steady though his heart pounded like a war drum. He skimmed the technical jargon, landing on the conclusion. Mason Bennett was James's biological father. He sank into his chair, leaning back, letting the truth seep in like rain into parched earth. He'd suspected it, but seeing it in black and white sharpened everything, like a painting suddenly brought to life with color. The question now wasn't the truth, but what he'd do with it. He'd sworn to himself he wouldn't let James face more instability, but keeping this from Mason Bennett was a dangerous gamble. The man had money, power, and if he learned of James, he'd claim the boy like a lost asset without hesitation. Hunter decided to say nothing. He'd protect James, keep him safe from the looming storm, at least until he had no other choice. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time, and when that day came, he'd face a battle fiercer than any deal he'd ever brokered. The truth weighed on Hunter daily, a silent shadow trailing him through Manhattan Tower's gleaming halls. James, meanwhile, settled into his new life, though he still carried the caution of a fledgling unsure of its nest. He wasn't used to forever. A luxury life had never granted him. Hunter understood that, for the boy had been abandoned too often, like a book forgotten on a shelf. But sometimes, in fleeting moments, he glimpsed a different James, the boy he could become if life were kinder. Like the day they visited a bookstore in Midtown, James's eyes lighting up like stars at the towering shelves of stories, his small hands brushing each spine like touching treasure. Or the time they strolled along the Hudson, autumn wind tousling his brown hair, and James suddenly asked, "What did you like doing as a kid?" The simple, earnest question made Hunter smile. A rare, warm smile, like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night, Hunter returned home, his leather briefcase hitting the floor with a dry thud. He found James at the dining table, an open book before him, but he wasn't reading. His brown eyes stared through the pages, as if peering into another world, one of memories and questions. "Something wrong?" Hunter asked, pulling out a chair to sit across from him, his voice soft as a gentle breeze. James hesitated, his fingers tracing the book's edge as if seeking comfort. "I was thinking about Mom," he admitted, his voice faint like leaves falling in the night. Hunter leaned forward, a pang of empathy tightening his chest. "About what?" James faltered. "She worked a lot. I didn't get why she was always tired, but now I think I do. She was trying to keep us okay, but she was sad too." Those words stabbed Hunter's heart like an invisible blade. Olivia had borne the weight of the world alone, carrying burdens she shouldn't have had to. "She loved you," Hunter said, his voice firm as a vow. "That's clearer than the sun." James nodded but didn't look up, his hands still fidgeting with the book as if clutching her memory. "Do you think she knew who my dad was?" The sudden question jolted Hunter, like a tightrope walker thrown off balance by a gust. James had never asked so directly. He weighed his words, careful as if stacking dominoes. "I think she suspected," he replied. "But maybe she wasn't sure he'd be the father you deserved." James looked up, his gaze sharp as if trying to see into Hunter's soul. "So he's a bad guy?" Hunter exhaled, a strained smile flickering like a passing cloud. "Not exactly. But he's powerful, and sometimes powerful people aren't good at loving family." James studied him for a moment, then asked, his voice small but resolute, "You know who he is, don't you?" Hunter's chest tightened. The moment he dreaded had arrived. "James, you know," he started, but the boy cut in, his whisper sharp as a blade. "I know you know. And you're not telling me." Hunter leaned forward, his voice steady yet tender like a promise. "I'm trying to protect you. I need to be sure before I say anything." James's hands clenched into fists, his eyes flashing with hurt. "Who is he?" Hunter hesitated, but he knew he couldn't dodge forever. "Mason Bennett," he said, the name dropping like a stone shattering a still lake. James frowned, searching his memory, then realized, his face darkened like the sky before a storm. "That billionaire on TV?" Hunter nodded. James shot up, his chair scraping the floor with a harsh screech, the sound of protest. "So what are you going to tell him now?" The anger in his voice wasn't just for Mason. It was aimed at Hunter too, and that cut deeper than any reproach. "Only if you want me to," Hunter replied, his tone calm as a harbor amid waves. "This is your life, James. You get to decide the next step." James stood there, breathing hard, his brown eyes torn with conflict. Hunter waited, silently hoping the boy would choose to stay, not because he feared Mason Bennett, but because he'd come to see James as an inseparable part of his life. James paced the living room, his small footsteps echoing on the marble floor like the anxious drumbeat of a restless tune. His emotions swirled like a miniature storm, torn between fear and anger, his hands clenched into fists as if trying to hold back the torrent of thoughts flooding through him. What if he finds out? His voice was hoarse, trembling like a cold wind rustling dry branches. What if he tries to take me away? Hunter rose from his chair, his stance steady like a pillar against the tide, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. I won't let that happen, he said, his voice deep and resolute, a vow etched in stone. No one's taking you anywhere unless you want it. James looked up, his sharp brown eyes scanning Hunter's face, searching for even a crack of deceit. Finding only steadfastness, he exhaled shakily, nodding as if he'd glimpsed light in the dark. That night, as Hunter lay in bed, the city lights twinkling through the window like scattered stars, he knew everything had changed irrevocably. The truth was now a double-edged sword, gleaming and perilous, hanging over his head. James had a father, not just anyone but Mason Bennett, a man of iron will and a heart cold as ice. Sooner or later he'd find out, and when that day came, Hunter had to be ready, a warrior preparing for the final battle. He'd promised James protection, and he intended to keep that promise, even if it meant facing the world, or one smug billionaire with a counterfeit smile. The fragile peace in the penthouse felt like a soap bubble, beautiful but liable to burst at any moment. Since James learned his father's identity, an invisible clock had begun ticking, each second passing like the heartbeat of fate. Mason Bennett wasn't the type to lurk in shadows, he was a lion on the hunt, always sniffing out blood from afar. Hunter harbored no illusions that the truth would stay buried forever. The question wasn't if but when, and what he'd do when the storm hit. In the days that followed, James grew quieter, like a fledgling wary of an approaching gust. He didn't know how to face the idea that his father was one of California's most powerful men. Hunter noticed subtle shifts. The boy was more restless, his eyes often drifting during conversations, as if his mind were a boat adrift on a sea of unanswered questions. Then one evening those questions erupted, like a smoldering flame finally catching the wind. A soft knock sounded at Hunter's office door, pulling him from a pile of financial reports, numbers that now seemed meaningless against a greater upheaval. He looked up to see James at the threshold, hands buried deep in the pockets of his new hoodie, his face taut like an unfinished painting. "Can I ask you something?" His voice wavered like dry leaves crunching underfoot. Hunter set his pen down, his gaze soft as a full moon. "Of course. What's on your mind?" James stepped in, lingering near the door like a hesitant guest, then took a deep breath, gathering courage from every corner of his being. "Do you think he'd want me?" The question dropped like a stone into the still lake of Hunter's heart, stirring painful ripples. He'd anticipated this, but hearing it from James's lips still stung, like a needle pricking an old wound. "James," he said gently, his voice warm as a lullaby, "sometimes people don't know what they have until it's gone. Your mom chose to keep you away from him. Not because you weren't worth it, but because she wanted to protect you." James gave a hollow scoff, a smile as lifeless as a fading light. "So she thought he was dangerous?" Hunter tilted his head, picking his words like pearls from sand. "Not exactly dangerous but powerful. He sees power as everything more than family. Your mom knew you deserved better than that." James nodded slowly, his eyes still clouded with confusion, like a ship lost in fog. "So if he found out about me, would he want me now?" Hunter rubbed his temple, fatigue creeping in like a cold draft. "I don't know, James. But I know this. You're not a commodity to be traded. Not a pawn in anyone's empire. You're you, and you alone decide your worth." James mulled over his words like a jeweler appraising a gem, then said, his voice small but firm, "I don't know if I want to meet him." Hunter smiled, a warmth spreading like a fire in winter. "Then you don't have to. That's your right." But the next day, everything flipped like a sudden whirlwind. Hunter was in a meeting at Manhattan Towers, his voice steady as he dissected a quarterly report, when the door flew open. Amelia, his unflappable assistant, burst in, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost, her breath ragged like someone fleeing a storm. "Sir," she stammered, "someone's here to see you. He says it's urgent." Hunter frowned, a bad feeling rising like an undertow. Who? Amelia swallowed hard, her eyes wide. Mason Bennett. The name thundered through him, chilling him to the bone. He took a deep breath, forcing calm over a surface ready to shatter. But inside he knew. The storm had reached his doorstep. He straightened his suit, his features hardening like tempered steel, then descended the stairs to the grand lobby. Each step echoed like a war drum, his heart a mix of dread and resolve. Mason Bennett wasn't the type for casual visits. He came to demand, to seize, and Hunter knew that better than anyone. As the lobby doors parted, he saw Mason's towering figure, his black suit gleaming like the armor of a dark knight, a smile on his lips as cold and sharp as a blade. Hunter stood tall, his gaze locking onto his adversary. Two beasts poised to clash on an open plain. He didn't know how much Mason had uncovered, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let James become a trophy in this man's power game. The battle had begun, and Hunter was ready to stake everything to keep his promise to the boy who'd become the light in his life. As the evening unfolded in the upscale restaurant, the crystal chandeliers glimmered like tiny stars suspended overhead. Mason Bennett grew quiet, his hands fidgeting as if he were about to step through a door with no return. He took a deep breath, reached into his suit pocket, and pulled out a pristine white envelope, its edges slightly creased as if bearing the marks of restless nights. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he said, his voice low like waves against a rocky shore, then gently slid it across the table, like launching a paper boat onto a river of fate. "But I wanted to give you this." James picked up the envelope, his sharp brown eyes scanning it with suspicion, like an archaeologist uncovering a strange relic. "What is it?" he asked, his voice small but edged like a testing blade. Mason smiled, a rare, strained smile that softened his usual air of authority. "A letter. I wrote it the night I found out about you. It's everything I wanted to say but didn't know how to voice." James held the envelope, his fingers brushing its surface as if touching a memory that never existed. He hesitated, then slipped it into his hoodie pocket, the movement slow as if tucking away a precious secret. He wasn't sure when he'd open it, maybe tonight, maybe years from now, but for now knowing it existed was enough, a small lamp flickering to life in the dark corner of his heart. As dinner drew to a close, the scent of coffee mingled with the soft clink of spoons against porcelain, a gentle melody in the air. Mason cleared his throat, breaking the awkward silence. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice deep like an evening bell echoing from afar. "But if you ever want to talk, if you want to be part of my life, the door's always open. No lock, no bolt, just waiting for you to step through." James looked up, his eyes locking onto Mason's, as if trying to read the man through every wrinkle on his face. After a long moment he nodded, a gentle dip like a bird settling on a branch. "Okay," he replied, his tone even but carrying a faint spark. It wasn't a promise or a firm commitment, but a seed planted in barren soil, a fragile start brimming with possibility. When James stepped out of the restaurant, the California night wrapped him in its gentle autumn chill. Hunter was waiting by the Cadillac, his figure steady as a lighthouse in the midnight sea. He studied the boy, his keen yet warm eyes sweeping over James's face, searching for traces of emotion like a reader with a cherished book. "How'd it go?" he asked, his voice low like waves lapping a harbor. James exhaled, his breath forming a thin mist in the air, then glanced back at the restaurant before meeting Hunter's gaze. "Better than I expected," he said, a faint smile flickering like a crescent moon through dark clouds. Hunter smiled back, his large hand resting on James's shoulder, warm and firm like an unspoken vow. "That's all that matters." On the drive home, city lights streaked past the car windows like shooting stars. James sat quietly in the back, clutching the envelope Mason had given him. His fingers traced its edges, feeling each fold as if touching an unopened mystery. He didn't open it, not yet ready to face words that might change everything. But for the first time in his life, he felt a glimmer pierce the icy shell around his heart. Maybe he wasn't alone in the world, not a drifting dry leaf as he'd once thought. He glanced at Hunter, the man who'd become his steadfast anchor amid life's storms, and a strange sensation welled up. Not quite happiness but peace, like a still lake after the wind dies down. When the car pulled up to the penthouse, James stepped out, the envelope still safe in his pocket. Hunter walked beside him, asking nothing more, a silent companion. Inside the living room, James sank onto the couch, the soft glow of a floor lamp illuminating his face, highlighting features still youthful yet beginning to bear the marks of maturity. He pulled the envelope out, setting it on his lap, staring at it for a long while as if it were a door to the past. "Do you think I should read it?" he asked, his voice soft as falling leaves. Hunter sat across from him, sipping whiskey, his eyes warm like a winter hearth. "When you're ready," he replied, his tone deep as a fatherly counsel. "It's not going anywhere." James nodded, placing the envelope on the coffee table, letting it rest alongside the chaos of his thoughts. He didn't open it that night, nor the next day, but each time he saw it, a little weight lifted. Not because of what might be inside, but because its existence proved he mattered to someone, whether a distant father or the man who'd opened his life to him. Hunter watched from a distance, his heart easing like a captain who'd weathered a storm with his ship intact. He knew the road ahead was long, that Mason Bennett could be a light or a shadow in James's life, but he trusted this boy, with a heart resilient as grass pushing through stone, to find his own path.